welcome to Starbound. My name is General G, and I'll be your narrator today. Nearly 500 supporters get early access to our stories, including brand new episodes of Sunspire Academy and Freyr and Remeke. If you'd like to unlock early access and support new episodes in future series, tap Join below to become a Starbound member. Now, let's get into today's story. When two Deathworld species meet, one bows wasn't just a phrase passed around the Galactic Council chambers. Though never formalized in any rulebook, the belief that Deathworlders could not interact without testing dominance was deeply ingrained. Literal or metaphorical, the bow didn't matter, because when two opposing forces meet at full speed, one must hit the brakes first, or both risk destruction. That belief existed unanimously and unspoken, as the public hall of the Galactic Council prepared for what many feared would become a precedent-setting clash. This chamber had witnessed countless diplomatic meetings, treaties signed, wars averted, and alliances forged. Yet none of those occasions had filled the opulent gathering space with the suffocating expectation that now permeated every molecule of recycled air. The scheduled meeting between humanity and the Laharians, the first official contact between these two Category 4 Deathworld species, had transformed the normally bustling hall into a theater of poorly hidden dread. A strange silence dominated the vast chamber. The hall itself seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, its adaptive lighting dimmed to a neutral white, as if fearing that even a slight change in illumination might trigger an incident. The Xiari delegation clustered near the eastern viewing platform, their typically transparent bipedal bodies clouded with gray fluids that swirled like storm systems beneath their translucent skin. For a species that communicated emotion through the colors of their inner fluids, the uniform gray was a clear sign of tension, as a scream would be for humans. The white light of the hall, usually absorbed and refracted through their bodies in colorful displays, now seemed to sink into the murky depths without reflection, creating shadows where there should have been rainbows. Ambassador Thryhix, the senior Xiari representative, stood rigidly beside his colleagues. The gray in his chest cavity so dense it appeared almost black. His two eyes, normally filled with curiosity, remained fixed on the two entrance points, the front ceremonial doors and the rear service gate. Every few moments, a ripple of darker gray would pulse through his form, betraying thoughts he dared not vocalize. The tight groups of avians scattered throughout the hall were uncharacteristically quiet. The Karathi delegation, known for their constant talking, huddled together with their blue feathers pressed flat against their bodies. Not a single trill or warble escaped their beaks. The Virex, with their predatory builds and razor-sharp talons, had positioned themselves near the exits, a tactical choice that spoke volumes about their expectations for the meeting of Deathworlders. Even the scaled species, masters of the diplomatic poker face, couldn't entirely hide their apprehension. The Sinian Commerce Guild representatives stood in their traditional formation, but their eyes, those ancient calculating orbs that had witnessed the rise and fall of entire civilizations, darted constantly between the entrances. Their tails, usually held in perfect stillness as a sign of control, betrayed them with minute tremors that sent ripples through the air. The agreed time for the feared encounter loomed closer with each passing moment, marked by the gentle pulse of the chronometer displays embedded in the walls. 8 minutes. 7. 6. Then, with calculated punctuality, the human delegation arrived 5 minutes early. The rear gate hissed open with a whisper, but in the tense silence of the hall, it might as well have been a thunderclap. 3 figures stepped through, unmistakably human, yet not what anyone had expected. The deliberate choice of the rear entrance was not lost on the assembled species. The Council had purposely arranged the docking procedures to ensure that humanity and the Laharians would not meet by chance in the docking bays. It was an unwritten rule, implemented after the Zarath Gorvok incident 3 years ago. when two Category 3 Deathworld species had nearly destroyed half a station after meeting by chance. The humans moved with that usual confidence of their species, that particular gait that somehow managed to convey both ease and coiled readiness. But their attire immediately set off warning signals throughout the hall. Instead of the typical black and white formal wear that human diplomatic teams favored, those crisp suits that attempted to project civilization over their predatory nature, these three wore rough, utilitarian garments in muted green. The fabric looked sturdy and practical. They guessed it was of military origin. Every eye, stalk, and sensory organ in the room fixed on the three humans as they made their way to the center of the room. The lead human, a male of average height for his species but still imposing by galactic standards, had close-cropped brown hair and eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the room in a single sweep. His companions flanked him on both sides, a female with auburn hair tied back in a severe bun, and a larger male whose bulk suggested either genetic predisposition or dedicated physical conditioning. The lead human stopped in the designated neutral zone at the center of the hall and began the traditional greeting rotation, approaching each species delegation in turn. His voice, when he spoke, seemed somewhat neutral. "Greetings, honored representatives. I'm Captain Dylan Sebastian," he said, the title immediately raising concerns. Military, not diplomatic. "This is Lieutenant Ivy, our arms officer." Several delegations physically recoiled at the casual mention of weapons expertise. "And this is Nick Volkov, our handyman." The large human, Nick, grinned at the introduction, a display of teeth that sent the Virex representatives stepping back despite their own predatory nature. "I fix things," he said simply, his accent thick with Earth's Eastern European inflections. "Sometimes before they break." The unusual choice for a diplomatic delegation sent red flags shooting through every protocol-trained mind in the room. No ambassadors, no cultural attachés, no trade representatives. A military officer, a weapons specialist, and someone whose job description seemed deliberately vague but ominous. Several delegations began discreetly activating their emergency communication channels, updating their ships and stations on the developing situation. As the minutes crawled by, the tension in the room ratcheted up with each tick of the chronometer. The Zeari were now fully gray, their bodies resembling storm clouds ready to burst. The avians had discreetly repositioned themselves, maintaining maximum distance from the central area while keeping clear paths to the exits. Several of the smaller species had quietly excused themselves entirely, deciding that discretion was indeed the better part of valor. The scaled species fared little better. The Sinians' tails now shook with visible tremors, the powerful appendages that could shatter bone barely under their owner's control. One of the Korthax representatives had stress-shed several scales, leaving small emerald discs on the polished floor. Then, with the chronometer showing exactly the appointed time, the front doors opened. The Laharian delegation's entrance was everything the council members had feared and more. Where they had expected, hoped for, diplomats in flowing robes or formal sashes, what appeared instead were three figures that embodied every nightmarish rumor about their species. Many of the council members, despite their preparation, found themselves shocked by the sight. Like the humans, the Laharians had clearly not sent a typical delegation. Three imposing pack leaders revealed themselves as they stepped into the room with a grace that contradicted their size. Each moved with the fluid, economical motion of an apex predator, their digitigrade legs carrying them forward in perfect synchronization. The Laharians stood as tall as the humans, their bodies a perfect blend of power and agility. Short muzzles revealed glimpses of fangs designed for the killing bite, while their pink noses twitched, sampling the air and cataloging every scent in the room: fear, anxiety, and obvious panic. Their manes, unruly and wild, framed faces that managed to convey intelligence despite features evolved for the hunt. The orange fur that covered their bodies was vivid, creating an almost flame-like effect as they moved. But it was their claws that drew every gaze and held it. Proudly exposed, retractable but extended, they clicked against the floor with each step. Each claw was curved and sharp enough to disembowel most species in the room with a casual swipe. The Laharians made no effort to hide them, no gesture toward the civilized fiction of filed-down or capped claws that some species adopted for diplomatic meetings. The certainty that today would not be a peaceful day spread through the assembled minds like a virus. Security teams throughout the station went to high alert. Medical bays began preparing trauma stations. Several species began composing what they assumed would be their final reports, documenting the moment when two Deathworld species finally met and the inevitable happened. The official liaison representing the council, a Zyari named Gremok, found himself in the unenviable position of standing between extinction-level predators. The gray fluid circulating through his transparent body had taken on an almost silver sheen, the Zyari equivalent of a full panic response. His eyes blinked in rapid succession as he fought to maintain his composure and perform his duty. Gremok had spent the previous minutes frantically researching both species, trying to prepare himself for this moment. He knew that humans, despite their recent emergence on the galactic stage, had already earned a reputation for unpredictability and surprising ruthlessness when threatened. Their history was littered with conflicts where they had turned disadvantages into victories through sheer stubborn refusal to acknowledge when they were beaten. The Laharians were, if anything, worse. One of the oldest known Deathworld species, they had evolved on a planet where cooperation within the pack was the only defense against even more terrifying predators. Their entire culture revolved around pack dynamics, hierarchies established through displays of dominance that could turn lethal in heartbeats. They had joined the galactic community only after determining that it posed no threat to their sovereignty, and even then, their interactions were limited and carefully controlled. Now Gremok stood between them, his body trembling with the effort of maintaining his form. The gray fluids within him swirled in chaotic patterns as he began the formal introductions. "Honored representatives of Earth," he began, facing the humans, "I present to you the delegation from Laharia. Pack leader Visara of the Northern Ranges." He gestured to the central figure, whose mane was particularly pronounced, and whose eyes held an intelligence that seemed to pierce through whoever she looked at. "Pack leader Ionak of the Burning Plains." The second Laharian, slightly smaller but with scars that spoke of numerous battles. "And pack leader Emira of the Frozen Peaks." The third, whose white-streaked fur suggested either age or the harsh conditions of her territory. Turning to the Laharians, Gremok continued, "Honored pack leaders, I present the representatives of Earth. Captain Dylan Sebastian, military liaison. Lieutenant Ivy, arms officer. Nick Volkov, technical specialist." He used the most diplomatic translation for handyman he could manage. The formalities complete, Gremok began backing away, his movements carefully calculated to show neither fear nor challenge. Every instinct in his evolved for peace and harmony body screamed at him to flee, to put as much distance as possible between himself and what was about to occur. The room went silent. Not the tense quiet of before, but the absolute stillness that precedes a stellar explosion. The two groups regarded each other across the small space that separated them, and every other being in the room held their breath, or whatever equivalent their species possessed. Captain Sebastian stood relaxed but ready, his hands loose at his sides in what humans considered a non-threatening posture, but what every prey species recognized as the stance of something that didn't need to posture to be dangerous. The Laharians held their own formation, pack leader Visara at the center with her companions, arranged in a subtle V formation behind her. Their tails, massive appendages that could serve as weapons in their own right, swayed slightly behind them. Their breathing was deep and even, chests expanding with each inhalation as they processed the scents of the humans before them. Then, in a movement that sent waves of panic through every observer, Vizara and Dylan each took a step forward. The room froze. They stood now a single step from each other, close enough that either could strike before anyone could intervene. Dylan was slightly taller, the human evolutionary adaptation for bipedalism giving him a height advantage, but Vizara's presence somehow seemed larger. Her claws, extended and gleaming in the white light, could open his throat before he could blink. Every species watching saw the moment differently. The prey species saw death incarnate facing off, two apex predators about to determine which evolution had produced the superior killer. The other predator species saw a challenge that would establish hierarchies not just between individuals, but between entire civilizations. The traders calculated the odds and began mental preparations for future market conditions depending on the outcome. This was it, the moment they had all feared, and in some dark corner of their minds, anticipated. When two of the strongest Deathworld species meet, one must bow. The only question was, which would submit and which would establish dominance? The crash was coming, the inevitable clash that would... Vizara bowed. The moment was fluid, graceful, and completely unexpected. The powerful Laharian lowered her front quarters, her head dipping down in what every species recognized as a gesture of submission. Her companions behind her mirrored the movement a heartbeat later, their forms lowering in perfect synchronization. The shock that rippled through the room was almost physical. Several data pads clattered to the floor as nerveless fingers released them. A Karathi representative released an involuntary chirp of surprise before clamping her beak shut in embarrassment. The Xiari turned transparent for a moment, their emotional control completely shattered by the impossibility of what they were witnessing. Where was the fight? How was this possible that a hierarchy had been established so quickly? Had there been some intimidating phenomenon from the human that the other species couldn't perceive? Some pheromone or subsonic vocalization that had forced submission? The human's posture had seemed relaxed, but perhaps that itself was the display. A predator so confident it didn't even need to threaten? The questions raced through 100 minds in a dozen different forms. Had humanity already won some intimidating competition that the other species couldn't even perceive? Was this the human secret, some psychological warfare that bypassed physical confrontation entirely? The implications were staggering. If humans could make even the Laharians submit without violence, what did that mean for the rest of the galaxy? But then something even more impossible happened. Dylan didn't gloat. He didn't snarl or growl or perform any of the dominance displays that Deathworlders typically exhibited when another species submitted to them. Instead, he simply lifted his hand and placed it gently on Vizara's head. His fingers brushed against her fur with a tenderness that seemed completely at odds with every model of Deathworlder behavior in the Council's extensive databases. And then, and this was the part that would require extensive documentation and analysis, he began to pet her. His fingers found the spots behind her ears, scratching gently at the base where the fur was finest. Vizara's eyes, which had been locked on his face, slowly closed. A sound emerged from her chest, a deep rumbling that the translation system struggled to categorize before finally settling on contentment, pleasure vocalization. The room erupted. The controlled silence shattered like crystalline armor under assault. Dozens of voices in as many languages rose in confusion, surprise, and desperate attempts to make sense of what they were witnessing. Translation systems overloaded as multiple species tried to speak at once, creating a feedback loop of polyglot chaos. Through the din, several themes emerged. The Ziari delegates were cycling through colors so rapidly they looked like living kaleidoscopes. Purple confusion mixing with yellow curiosity and flashes of orange that indicated complete cognitive dissonance. The avians had burst into full song, their instinctive response to extreme surprise overwhelming their diplomatic training. The scaled species were hissing in frequencies that spoke of alarm and incomprehension. Finally, through sheer force of will and the amplification of his position, Gremok managed to restore some semblance of order. His form had shifted to a deep blue-green that indicated someone operating far outside their comfort zone but determined to proceed. "Please!" His voice cut through the chaos. "Order! We must have order!" Gradually, the noise subsided to a dull roar of whispered conversations and sub-vocal emanations. "Pack Leader Vizara," Gremok continued, all four of his eyes fixed on the scene before him. "The Council requires an explanation. Why have the Laharians bowed to the humans?" Vizara's eyes opened, though she made no move to lift her head from beneath Dylan's still-moving fingers. When she spoke, her voice boomed through the translation systems, with the authority of someone used to being heard across vast hunting grounds. "The Laharians bow to no one." The simple statement sent another wave of confusion through the room. Several species demanded explanations in their native tongues, creating another surge of translation chaos. Gremok, his color shifting to deeper blue-green, raised his appendages for silence. But we all saw." He gestured helplessly at the scene before them, where Dylan continued his gentle ministrations and Vizara showed no signs of moving. "You clearly submitted to the human delegation." "I did no such thing," Vizara rumbled, and there was something in her tone that might have been amusement. "I simply made it easier for him to pat my head." The cognitive dissonance this statement created was almost visible. Several of the more literally minded species began consulting their translation devices, certain there must be some error. The Korthax representative's tail thrashed once, sending several more scales scattering across the floor. Dylan, apparently deciding it was time to intervene, cleared his throat. The sound was soft, but it commanded attention in a way that spoke to some deep instinct in every species present. His hand never stopped its gentle motion on Vizara's head as he spoke. "I'd like to thank the Council for this opportunity to meet with the Laharians again," he said, and that single word, "again," sent another ripple of shock through the room. "I know this must look weird to all of you, but I can explain what's happening here. This is most irregular," one of the Sinian representatives managed, his voice steady despite the tremor in his tail. "Deathworld species do not act so friendly. The behavioral models are quite clear on this point." Vizara lifted her head slightly, though not enough to dislodge Dylan's hand. "Stupid models made by stupid people," she said. Gremok, desperately trying to salvage some semblance of the meeting he had prepared for, stepped forward again. "Pack Leader Vizara, you say this is not submission, but your actions... Captain Sebastian, you say you can explain. The Council insists on understanding what we are witnessing here." Dylan nodded, finally removing his hand from Vizara's head. She rose to her full height, and several delegates took involuntary steps back, even though she made no threatening moves. "This isn't actually the first time humanity has met the Laharians," Dylan said, his words measured and careful. "We encountered each other once before, under some peculiar circumstances. We were unable to keep in contact afterward due to various factors, but..." He glanced at Vizara, who made a sound that the translators interpreted as amusement. "But the bonds formed during that first meeting were significant," Vizara completed. "Wait." Gremok's color shifted to a pale yellow, of dawning comprehension mixed with even deeper confusion. You're saying that humans and Laharians have met before, outside of Council supervision? That's technically illegal, yes, Dillon admitted with a shrug that was purely human in its casual dismissal of regulations. But as I said, the circumstances were peculiar. You must explain, another council member insisted. The council must know how this, whatever this is, came to be. Two Deathworld species meeting in peace, without conflict, with... He gestured helplessly at where Dillon's hand had returned to rest on Vizara's shoulder. Affection? Dillon and Vizara exchanged a look that spoke of shared memories and nostalgic feelings. Several of the more empathetically sensitive species in the room shivered at the emotional resonance between them. It's a bit of a long story, Dillon warned. It involves crashed ships, hostile wildlife, shared disasters, and the discovery that sometimes, just sometimes, two predator species can find common ground in the most unlikely places. We have time, Gremok said quickly, before anyone could object. The prospect of understanding this impossibility overrode all other considerations. The Council will hear this story. Vizara made that amused sound again. It also involves why Nick is really here, she said, glancing at the large human who grinned in response, and why I specifically requested that Dillon bring his handyman. Ah, Nick said, his grin widening. Is good story, has explosions. And ice storms, Emira added, speaking for the first time. Her voice was lighter than Vizara's, but carried its own authority. Don't forget the plant, Ivy added with a smirk that showed too many teeth. The plant was important. The assembled delegates looked between the two groups, noting the easy familiarity, the inside references, the complete lack of tension between apex predators who should have been at each other's throats. Everything they thought they knew about Deathworld species interactions was crumbling before their eyes. Very well, Gremok said, his form settling into the deep green of determination. Tell us this story. Tell us how humans and Laharians met, and why, when two Deathworld species encountered each other, instead of one bowing in submission, you... He paused, searching for words to describe what he had witnessed. Why we became friends, Vizara supplied simply. Why Dillon's fingers know exactly where to scratch behind my ears, and why I trust him enough to lower my head in his presence. Why our packs are not rivals but allies. Tell them, Dillon, of the ice world and the crashed ships and the months that changed everything. Dillon nodded, settling himself cross-legged on the floor, in a gesture that was both casual and strategically positioned to place him at the center of every sightline in the room. Vizara lowered herself beside him, taking a seat and somehow making them appear more like close friends than competitors from different species. All right, Dillon began, his voice taking on the cadence of a storyteller. But remember, you asked for this. It starts 3 years ago on a planet designated MK-130 in the neutral zone. A human exploration vessel and a Laharian scout ship both got involved into a normal first contact misunderstanding, both crashing on the same frozen hell world. The assembled species leaned in, drawn despite themselves to understand this impossibility. And in that moment, the Grand Council Hall transformed from a place of fear and tension to something unprecedented, a gathering where predator and prey species alike came together to hear a tale of two Deathworld species who had done the impossible. They had met by chance, and neither had bowed. Dillon's voice carried through the hushed council chamber as he began their tale. 3 years ago, the exploration vessel Pioneer's Hope was conducting routine surveys in the neutral zone. We'd been out for 6 months, mapping resource deposits, when our sensors picked up an energy signature we couldn't identify. Already, the council members were shifting uneasily. The neutral zone was disputed space. a buffer between territories that had prevented countless wars. That two Deathworld species had been operating there simultaneously sent ripples of anxiety through the gathered delegates. Vizara took up the narrative, her rumbling voice causing several smaller species to inch backward. The Swift Claw had been tracking those same readings for days. We thought we'd found a derelict vessel from the old wars, easy salvage, valuable technology. Instead, we found each other, Dylan said with a rueful smile that didn't reach his eyes. Two armed vessels appearing suddenly in disputed space, both assuming the worst. A Karathi delegate's feathers flattened against her body as she processed the implications. Two predator species, armed and surprised. The scenario that haunted every prey species' nightmares. The engagement was brief, but it hurt both ships, Dylan continued. Our kinetic weapons against their plasma claws. Neither side bothering with warnings or communication, just violence. The Ziari delegation was slowly turning a deeper gray, the fluid movements within their transparent bodies accelerating with distress. Our navigation array was destroyed in the first salvo, Vizara said, her claws pressing against the floor as she shifted position. Life support took critical damage. We managed to give as good as we got. Their engines were crippled, but by then it was too late for either ship. MK-130's gravity well caught us both, Dylan explained. A frozen hell world, barely classified as habitable. We fought all the way down, still firing even as our ships burned through the atmosphere. Nick leaned forward, adding his perspective. Crash scattered across 5 square kilometers of ice. Temperature was minus 60 in daylight, minus 90 at night. Half our supplies lost or damaged. Should have been death sentence. The council chamber's environmental systems vibrated in the silence that followed. Several delegates were consulting their data pads, pulling up information on MK-130. The results only deepened their horror. The planet was classified as Category 9 Deathworld, unsurvivable for most species even with full equipment. We could see each other, Dylan continued. 2 ships, crashed on the same frozen plain. Close enough to observe, too far to attack without exposing ourselves to the elements. So we watched. Round-the-clock surveillance, Vizara added. Every repair attempt, every movement outside the ships, cataloged and analyzed. My packmates were convinced the humans were preparing for assault. Why else work so frantically? Because we were dying, Dylan said simply. Our heating systems were failing. Food wouldn't last more than 3 weeks. Every day we delayed increased the chances we'd be too weak to attempt repairs. Gramok's color shifted to a sickly yellow-green, the Ziari equivalent of fascination. 2 Deathworld species, wounded and trapped together. It was like something from the horror stories his clutchmates used to tell. After a week, the situation became clear, Vizara said. Neither ship would fly again without major repairs. We had 2 options. Attempt to take the other ship by force, hoping enough of us survive to use their parts. Or, she paused, and in that silence, every prey species in the room held their breath. They knew what came next in the traditional script. The stronger would destroy the weaker, cannibalize their technology, and escape. It was the way of predators. Or cooperate after trying to kill each other, Dylan finished. The unthinkable option. A wave of disbelief rippled through the chamber. Several Sinian representatives' tails began that telltale tremor of extreme stress. The very concept violated everything they understood about Deathworlder psychology. I made the first move, Dylan continued. Against all advice, I opened a general comm channel one night. No encryption, no formal hailing, just talking, describing our situation, admitting weakness to another unknown species. I almost didn't answer, Vizara admitted. Everything in my training screamed trap. We don't show vulnerability. It's an invitation to attack. but something in his voice, the honest desperation. "We talked through the night," Dylan said. "By dawn, we'd agreed to meet, in person, alone." The chamber erupted in gasps, chirps, and hisses of dismay. Even the normally composed Korthax delegation showed their agitation. Several members stress-shedding scales that clattered to the polished floor. "The next morning, I walked out onto that frozen plain," Dylan continued, his voice growing distant with memory. "The wind was screaming, ice crystals like razors. Every step taking me further from safety, closer to what my instincts insisted was certain death. I watched him come," Vizara said. "This strange bipedal figure, no claws, no fangs, moving across the killing ground between our ships. My packmates thought I'd gone mad. Maybe I had." We met halfway, just the two of us, standing in a blizzard, each capable of killing the other in seconds. Dylan's hand unconsciously moved to his throat. "I think Vizara could have torn me apart before I could draw a weapon." "And he carried weapons I couldn't see or smell," Vizara added. "Humans hide their killing tools, at least with claws. You know where you stand." The council members were leaning forward despite themselves, drawn into the impossible tale. Several had stopped taking notes, too absorbed to remember their duties. "I sat first," Vizara said, lowered myself to the ice. In my culture, it showed I wasn't planning to pounce, though I kept my claws extended. "And I set my pistol aside and leaned against a rock," Dylan said. "We must have sat there for an hour, just talking, working out how to survive." "The agreement we reached was simple," Vizara explained. "Pool resources, share expertise, no sudden movements, armed guards at all meetings. And if cooperation failed, we'd settle it the traditional way." "Blood on ice," Ionak growled from behind Vizara. "As it should be." The casual reference to violence set another wave of distress through the prey species. But it was the predator species who seemed most unsettled. The Virex delegation huddled together, their usual proud postures abandoned. This cooperation between competitors violated every understanding of territorial behavior. "The first joint work crews were disasters," Nick said, shaking his head. "Everyone armed, everyone watching for betrayal. Almost ended when someone dropped tool. Sounded like weapon charging." "But the cold was a harsher master than fear," Ivy added. "When you can see your breath freezing and falling as snow inside your helmet, you learn to cooperate quickly." 2 weeks in, we faced our biggest test," Dylan said. "We had to shut down both ships' main reactors for repairs. No heat except emergency supplies, no power for weapon systems." The implications weren't lost on the Council. Disabling weapons in the presence of another Deathworld species was tantamount to baring one's throat. "We worked in mixed teams," Vizara continued. "Humans and Laharians side by side, moving components that took multiple bodies to lift. Every moment was an exercise in trust." "Or desperation," Dylan corrected. "There were close calls. A Laharian's claw grazing human skin while maneuvering equipment. Humans moving too quickly and triggering hunting instincts. Each time we had to choose, give in to instinct or keep working." "The weather chose for us," Vizara said grimly. "Storm hit on day 18, worst we'd seen. Winds that could throw a grown Laharian off their feet. Temperature dropped to -100. "Both crews were exhausted," Dylan picked up the story. "We'd been sleeping in shifts, maintaining separation. But that night, the improvised heaters in both ships began failing." Nick's grin was wolfish as he remembered. "I was the one who said it first. We freeze apart or live together. Humans generate good body heat. Laharians have excellent fur. Simple math." The council chamber went utterly still. Several delegates had stopped breathing entirely. processing the impossibility of what they were hearing. Deathworld species sharing sleeping spaces? The intimacy of it, the vulnerability, was beyond comprehension. That first night was tense, Dylan admitted. Both crews in the human ship pressed together for warmth. Every accidental touch potentially lethal. But exhaustion won. We slept. I woke to find one of them curled against my side, Emira said softly, throwing a look at Nick. After that night, everything changed, Vizara said. The barriers we'd maintained, the careful distances, they crumbled. We weren't two crews forced together anymore. We were pack, Dylan finished. It happened gradually, then all at once. Shared meals, shared stories, humans learning to read Laharian ear positions, Laharians understanding human facial expressions. Your engineer taught us human card games, Ionak rumbled. I taught her to hunt ice borrowers, small creatures, but good protein. 6 weeks, Dylan said. 6 weeks of the hardest work any of us had ever done. Rebuilding one functional ship from 2 wrecks. By the end, we moved as one unit. I learned where Vizara liked to be scratched, Dylan added quietly. She learned that humans need verbal reassurance during stress. Small things that built into something unprecedented. The reactions throughout the chamber were visceral. The Ziari delegation had gone nearly transparent with shock, their internal fluids moving so slowly they seemed frozen. The avian species were producing subsonic distress calls that made the air vibrate unpleasantly. Even the usually stoic scaled species were showing signs of extreme agitation, tails lashing, scales shifting to threat displays. The day we finally launched, cobbled together from pieces of both ships, was bittersweet. Vizara said, We'd survived the impossible, but we all knew what came next. Separation, Dylan said heavily. Return to our respective spaces. Reports to file, explanations to give. Neither government would understand or approve. We parted at the nearest neutral station, Vizara continued. Filed reports that minimized the cooperation. Let our superiors believe what they wanted about repairs and parallel survival. Tried to forget. 3 years, Dylan said, his voice barely above a whisper. 3 years of wondering. Of remembering faces around a makeshift heater, sharing warmth and stories, of missing something. When the council announced this meeting, Vizara said, both delegations reached out immediately, secret communications, and we reconnected. We would not pretend to be enemies, Dylan said firmly, not after what we'd shared, not after becoming family in everything but blood. The word family, applied across species lines, sent visible shudders through the assembly. Gremok had gone such a deep purple he looked like a bruise with eyes. His vocal synthesizer crackled with strain as he spoke. You're telling us that 2 Category 4 Deathworld species have formed lasting emotional bonds? That you consider each other pack? More than that, Vizara said, lowering her head. Without hesitation, Dylan's hand found the spot behind her ears, fingers working through fur as he sat beside her. We trust each other with vulnerabilities. Dylan knows exactly where I cannot reach to groom. I know a lot of things about him. The plant, Ivy added, changing the subject in a hurry. Don't forget to tell them about the plant. Later, Dylan said, smiling. The point is, we survived and we are friends now. Your behavioral models assume Deathworlders must always establish dominance, Vizara said, addressing the horrified council directly. We don't agree. The council chamber descended into chaos. Multiple species were attempting to speak at once, their translators creating a cacophony of overlapping concerns. The primary theme was terror, not of violence but of alliance. Order! Gremok's voice cut through the noise, amplified by his position. This is This cooperation you describe, it's unnatural. Deathworld species don't form cross-species alliances. We did, Dylan said simply, and our species had just signed a number of cooperation agreements before today's meeting. The silence that followed was deafening. Around the chamber, prey species huddled together, their worst nightmares materializing before them. The Ziari had turned completely transparent in shock. Avian delegates trembled, feathers pressed flat in primal fear. Even the predator species seemed unsettled. The natural order they understood was crumbling. Grimmock's voice cracked as the terrible realization dawned. When two Deathworld species meet, one must bow. But neither of you truly bowed. Oh, but one did bow, Vizara corrected, lowering her head as Dylan's fingers found a particularly good spot. Just not in submission. It was only then, under the scrutiny of many different eyes, that the Council realized the age of Deathworld cooperation had truly begun.